Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support me on the local Subscribestar, and buy me a coffee. So today's episode, Seeing Behind the Mask, is sort of a reiteration of earlier concepts that I've mentioned before. The idea of the simulation will sort of be an implicit underlying principle here, but I think to start off, we have a really good example from the Twilight Zone episode, "The Masks," which is about a dying old man on Mardi Gras and 4 of his children coming to collect his inheritance. Now, they're all some form of vice, whether it's cruelty or greed or vanity or something like that. And he then says to his children they can't get the inheritance unless they wear masks. These are death masks. He has one of his own, which is a skull, and the others are various sorts of twisted faces. And he says that they represent who they truly are. And right before he dies, he says this. Jason Foster's the dying man. "Why indeed, Emily? Because you're cruel and miserable people, because none of you respond to love. Emily responds only to what her petty hungers dictate, a prime example being her marriage to Wilfred, a marriage which broke her dear late mother's heart in every sense. Wilfred responds only to things that have weight and bulk and value. He feels books, he doesn't read them. He appraises paintings, he doesn't seek out their truth or their beauty. And Paula, their lives in a mirror. The world is nothing to her than a reflection of herself, and her brother, humanity, to him is a small animal caught in a trap to be tormented. His pleasure is the giving of pain, and from this he receives the same sense of fulfillment most human beings get from a kiss or an embrace. Your caricatures, all of you without your masks, your caricatures." Now, the principle of this episode is, spoiler alert, when he's dead and takes off, they take off their masks, their faces have now changed to what they were wearing. Of course, it's a Twilight Zone episode. And what it's saying is that their normal faces, the front they were putting on for their dying father, or father-in-law in the case of Wilfred, was a mask. And the mask actually revealed their true nature as carefully given by the father. So that's a sort of, I think, interesting introduction to this idea, because what often happens with both masks and images is that we confuse one for the other, the truth for the facade. So one of the main challenges throughout all of history and today is seeing things for what they truly are. For example, everybody intuitively understands the importance of differentiating fool's gold, pyrite, from real gold. If you make the mistake, you've been cheated out of money. Or on a more meta or strategic level, a precondition for action is knowledge of environment and knowledge of desired outcomes. Correct knowledge of the environment in which you are acting and the nature of the end in sight are all necessary preconditions for successfully attaining one's goal. This knowledge of correctly observing and seeing things for what they are is also essential in threat assessment. Which fights are worth fighting at all? How often are you engaged in a fight that didn't need to happen at all? You even admit so after the fact. Also, how would you tell you are under a threat of attack? Oftentimes, a subtle assailant will make his attack look not like an attack. A good example in modern times is corporate food production. They make us sick and enfeebled by poisoning us with seed oils, a low-grade poison that affects memory and causes inflammation and therefore affects motor skills and thought. This is not sold to you as an attack, but as food. The beneficiaries are, of course, the food industry, since it cuts costs, and also the medical industry. The medical industry benefits in that it has a fixed supply or captive market of sick people to sell medications to. And again, there's always that Far Side cartoon, a patient cured is a customer lost. Why might people not see the thing for what it is? At least 3 reasons. 1 is ignorance, 2 is passion, 3 is deception. A man might not see something as poisonous because he does not know enough about the thing. For example, the copperhead snake and the corn snake both look alike, but the former is venomous and the latter not. If you only knew one of the snakes, then you would make a mistake that might cost you your life. Man is an amphibian living in both the world of spirit and matter. Man also seems to be more firmly rooted in matter and has a harder time seeing the world from the point of view of spirit. This leads to his passions, appetites, and desires, or what Plato calls the black horse, getting in the way of things. Anger, lust, pride, etc. can all cloud a man's vision so he cannot see what is right in front of him. For example, the anger and despair of Huron in the Silmarillion allows Morgoth to twist what he sees. Morgoth does not show Huron lies, but Huron sees the truth in a slanted way, which ultimately works to the benefit of Morgoth's broader plans in Middle-earth. Lastly, someone is intentionally trying to deceive you so that you cannot see the thing for what it is. One might think of the twisting of the word free speech. Historically, free speech meant the right to criticize powerful people, initially in government or in the church, and later in corporate enterprise, without fear of reprisal, imprisonment, or death. In the post-war era, it has mutated into a carte blanche for any and all kinds of vulgar expression in both verbal and visual content, forgetting the absurd notion that images are not speech. This leads to the functional destruction of real free speech to criticize a political system and substitutes it with smut. Meanwhile, we all live in an increasingly repressive society. The false signification based on either ignorance, passion, or deceit, I call the image, or the name of the episode, the mask. The image is not what it really is. We can, of course, speak of a true image, whereby the sign and the thing that is signified by the sign is really and truly the same thing, and the thing being signified is in itself the true thing. One might truly signify a cheat, and that is a necessary condition for avoiding being taken advantage of. But the thing signified is still a cheat. We need to both properly signify a thing, and the thing being signified must itself correspond to reality. Okay, so that's a bit of a mouthful. So let's go back to the fool's gold and gold analogy, right? On the one level, you need to be able to correctly identify that, say, someone who's exchanging your goods or service for fool's gold is doing so. Now, you might come to a correct evaluation of that image, but it's not real gold. But you know that, right? But then if somebody is exchanging gold for your goods and services, then you have not only an image which correctly adheres to what you're seeing, but the thing that you're seeing itself correctly adheres to the image. The gold is really gold, not fool's gold. We read in 1 Samuel 16:7, and I quote, "But the Lord saith unto Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as a man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." The idea captured here is that man tends to look superficially at things and miss the deeper underlying reality. God does not want his children doing so. This skill of being able to read behind the image or behind the mask in a secular context is exemplified by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. In A Study in Scarlet, Sherlock Holmes explains reasoning backwards thusly. There are a few people, however, who, if you told them a result, would be able to evolve from their own inner consciousness what the steps were which led up to that result. This power is what I mean when I talk of reasoning backwards, or analytically. And from the Silver Blaze, actually we'll get to that in a minute, the power of analytical reasoning so defined is that it allows the observer to look at a set of conditions and determine what must be the case for the set of conditions to hold. Imagination is a necessary prerequisite for this operation as described in the Silver Blaze. "See the value of imagination," said Holmes. "It is the one quality which Gregory lacks. We imagine what might have happened, acted upon the supposition, and found ourselves justified. Let us proceed." If one lacks imagination and cannot imagine or see more than what is being shown you, you will fall for the cheat every time. This lamentable state is the result of industrial civilization. To quote Carlyle, has turned mechanical. Men are grown mechanical in head and heart, as well as in hand. This process stifles and strangles the imaginative power in man. This is also why modern man is the biggest dupe of them all, unable to see a cheat that a child could see through. Now, the other thing, too, is this concept which all Christians have more or less believed, but was articulated and given name by John Calvin, the sensus divinitatis, that all men have this sense or knowledge of the divine, which, again, in the modern age seems to be in retreat for some reason. There's various reasons for that. I think part of it is, in part, this mechanical way of thinking, which excludes and drives out other higher modes of thinking which would attach us to the divine. It also separates us from nature and in each other as well. So, which also then precludes relationship to divine, because as the psalmist says, the created world, the stars in the sky point out to the greatness of God. And so there is, so what God is getting at in 1 Samuel 16, and what Conan Doyle is getting at with Sherlock Holmes and backward reasoning, is there is a way that a thing appears to be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is that way. And so it's up to the observer, the person experiencing this situation, to be able to have the wisdom and the foresight to make that distinction, to distinguish the real from the unreal, what appears to be the case from what is not the case. A discussion on this subject would be incomplete without a mention of Baudrillard's levels of simulation. 1, a more or less faithful representation of the real. 2, attempts to conceal what is there. 3, attempts to conceal what is not there. 4, makes no reference to anything but itself, also known as hyperreality. Part of this problem is also that there is a fourth vector for mistaking the image, which is an organic process within society and not necessarily nefarious. As one multiplies images and you have the copy of the copy of the copy, you get into the territory of simulacrum and confusion without even intending to do so. This is why prohibitions related to images in the Abrahamic tradition exist, in order to protect us from this realm of confusion and deception. How does one see the heart of a man? Imagine the explanation to an observed phenomena or discern the cheat. There is no easy or simple solution. There is no 5-step program, only the long and disciplined work of years to understand what is real and what is not. The task is immeasurably harder living in our modern age, where there are 1,001 distractions and images to confuse us, sedate us, and control us. In fact, the real world, as man once knew it, only exists in books. As a Christian, I would, of course, recommend the Bible. For as C.S. Lewis says in Mere Christianity, God made us, invented us as man invents an engine. A car is made to run on petrol, and it would not run properly on anything else. Now, God designed the human machine to run on himself. He himself is the fuel our spirits were designed to burn, or the food our spirits were designed to feed on. There is no other. That is why it is just no good asking God to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. God cannot give us happiness and peace apart from himself, because it is not there. There is no such thing. Now, of course, I've just made all these claims about not using mechanical or industrial analogies. Nonetheless, even though Lewis does do this, his insight is fundamentally correct. This is sort of like a blueprint or a manual for how humans ought to work. Of course, the great classics of Homer, Virgil, Dante, Shakespeare, and Milton, as well as history, give one the perspective of reality. Specifically, the patterns that repeat through all ages without respect to time, geography, religion, or ethnicity. I often talk about insight, and how insight is the unique ability to see right to the answer to a question without the process of reasoning to it. Some men are born with this insight, but it can also be cultivated and developed. What familiarity with these sources will give you is the ability to see that an action or sentiment, if real, leaves us with a corresponding result. The classic example is the distinction between a noble suitor of a woman and a seducer. Both might describe their feelings for her in poetic ways, but one will respect certain boundaries and seek to act according to the universal principles of decency. The seducer will seek to take advantage of the situation to subvert the norms of decency and use her and then leave. In modern times, the seducer has become the norm because women have lost the insight of looking to the follow-up. Another example would be the friend versus the flatterer. The friend might tell you a hard truth, unpleasant in the moment, but to your long-term good. The flatterer will tell you some lie, pleasant in the moment, and that harms you in the long run. The final result in both of these cases determines what is truth in the initial interaction. The problem is between the authentic and the farce. In the myths, legends, and literature of the West, the honorable suitor has a pure heart, and while his heart cannot be seen directly, the actions which flow from it can be. The seducer as well. His evil heart will show in his actions no matter how subtle. The fundamental truth is this: a man acting from a pure heart will do and say things that a man operating from an evil heart cannot do or say. The way one parses between the two is looking for those actions only a man with a pure heart can do. The problem is such men are few these days, and the old stories are forgotten like the old Narnians and Prince Caspian. Again, only by gaining familiarity with the written material can this knowledge be acquired today. Of course, in the past, you would be instructed to make these observations, and you could see such men in action. I mean, again, there used to be a time and a place where there were men that already knew this, and they would then instruct you as you grew up. That's not the case anymore. It's something that's been lost. And again, I think a good example for all of this is Prince Caspian in the Chronicles of Narnia, because all the old myths and old legends, quote unquote, old Narnia, is suppressed by the new Narnians, the Telmarines, led by Lord Miraz. So there's this idea that we're not supposed to look at these things, we're not supposed to think about these things. And in so doing, the problem then becomes we can't actually see the thing for what it is. Because when you have this, going back to Carlyle, this merely mechanical understanding of things and looking at it only in this narrow, one-dimensional way, you begin to treat things that they are what they are and nothing more or less. So if you are dealing with the machine and you give it an input and then it gives you an output, it is what it appears to be, right? It gives you the result that you put into it, or you put in an action and it gave you the result that you wanted. Now, you might then, if it malfunctions, think, okay, well, something's not working, and then decide to, quote, look under the hood, unquote, and then keep moving. Now, I guess you could say that person who's looking at this particular mechanical operation is, on the one hand, using this, reasoning backwards to say, hey, something must be wrong if I didn't get the desired result that I wanted. And then he looks at the guts of the machine and tries to figure out what went wrong. The problem, though, is when it comes to interpersonal relationships, and that same man sees something not working out, and then he tries to look at the proverbial guts of the people he's dealing with, he's treating them as this one-dimensional input-output like a machine. How often have we heard man is just a biological machine? Of course, that's never going to work, because that's not what man is. Man is much more complicated and nuanced than that. And the older modes of parsing man's psyche to determining motives and actions has been largely forgotten. It's not something that's encouraged anymore. And so, for example, there's a Christ says that no man testifies of himself. But in modern American culture, which is behind the cash nexus, everybody has to self-promote to get ahead. Of course, self-promotion in many ways is often just another form of lying because it's advertising. And I've already covered what Baudrillard had to say about advertising before with McLuhan, the medium is the message. Well, what happens is that you lose any context for meaning at all. And so it just becomes meaninglessness. And you could also argue the meaninglessness of modern scientism is in some sense related or an outgrowth of the meaninglessness of advertising. Because ultimately, even before we had modern scientism, we had this, commercial revolution, which, depending on how far back you want to go, began in the 14th century with Italian city-states and Holland. So there's that. And what happens is people will tell you that they always are operating from the most noble motivations. Now, if they're a part of your clique or your political ideology or your friend group, you believe it. And in fact, you have to believe it because it's a part of it's part of tribal membership. You have to believe that they're operating on the principles that they say they're operating on, even when they're clearly not. Now, then you might say that all your opponents are operating on base motives, and you can see right through their deceits, whatever your political persuasion is, or religious persuasion in the modern West. But it doesn't really matter because you've, again, taken this one-dimensional, crude framework and overlaid it on top of human interaction. And so you can't really see when somebody's transparently being power-seeking. They'll, like, for example, right, especially within churches, if men want to rise the ladder, they always have to say in public, I'm not seeking political power. I'm not seeking, office. I'm not seeking office from the church, blah, 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 blah. But behind the scenes, they're scheming and backstabbing. And when they finally get the offer, they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't see this coming. How could this happen? Wow, isn't it amazing? I mean, we see this in politics too. And it's all patently absurd. But then everybody says, well, but my guy, the guy that I like isn't doing it, but all the others are. Well, I mean, the inside joke's that they're all doing it. And you're just playing favorites, which, you're not supposed to do. And it doesn't really help in the long run. And as I said earlier, there's no real, well, okay, I guess there is a kind of formula once you become familiar enough with the materials. But what I would say is read stories where the older stories where the good guy, where you know who the good guy is and you know who the bad guy is, and then be careful attention about how they act and how characters within those stories look at those actions and draw conclusions. Because these serve a didactic purpose. They are an assistance to moral education. So a good example of this would be in Bree, where the hobbits meet Aragorn and Strider in the Fellowship of the Ring, but they're not really sure what to do with him because he looks kind of dangerous, he looks kind of rough and scary, and they don't know who to trust because they're in a strange place. They're being chased by the Black Riders, and so Aragorn does eventually get a little put out because he's like, well, you can't skeptic Max forever. You're being chased by Black Riders. You're going to have to choose. Now, of course, in the narrative, Butterbur finally gives the letter that Gandalf wrote to Frodo, which tells him that, okay, Strider's safe. But there are certain things that Strider didn't do that indicates that he's a good guy. Right? He might look rough. He might look like he's in the shadows, possibly a villain. But, for example, when Frodo puts on the ring and he disappears, Aragorn sort of already knows about the ring, but doesn't really take advantage of Frodo in a way that you'd expect a villain to do so. Also, he goes out of his way to tell Frodo about things that he ought to do for his own safety in a way that, again, a villain wouldn't do. But then you get a lot of these interesting psychological novels written by Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, where the bad guys are much more subtle. And then, but again, within the narrative unfolding, they are revealed to be bad guys. And then you can look at their behavior as cues that, hey, this is an indication that this is bad. And so the problem is how do you do that? Well, you do that by repetition. You continue reading it, you think about it. Now, of course, if you're a Christian, then you also ask for insight from God, because he will then help you see the true course or heart of a thing, right? So the sword of the Spirit is sharper than any two-edged sword, cutting through bone and marrow, helping the man to discern. But discernment, the ability to see the thing, because the first step is you have to know what is the truth or what is the real. So if you don't know what the truth or the real is, then you can't know what the fake is or the cheat. Now, part of the problem is we live in an age where everybody says there is no truth. Well, isn't that convenient? Who benefits from that statement, right? Because now you've been cut off from any means to avoid being taken advantage of, hurt, or tricked, because you have no frame of reference to compare to now. And then you also have the statement attributed to Cicero where he said that a man will remain a child as long as he's ignorant of history, which is also why we have a war on history. We also see a similar war on history in 1984 being justified as a way to maintain political control, because nobody knows what life before the control of the party was like. And in that regard, it cuts you off. So because we are cut off in all of these ways from these principles, this is really where we have to begin recovering that belief. Now, I guess you could talk about thought experiments or how you could train yourself to do this. Now, many years ago, when I was in high school, I read all of the Sherlock Holmes novels. And that sort of reasoning backwards has been with me ever since then. And when I first started reading these novels, I'm like, oh, come on. How does Sherlock Holmes always seem to know how to connect all the dots? It just seems like, Conan Doyle's writing a story, and the outcome is the way it is because he wrote it, right? Now, a bad author will just make it turn out that way. But if you read the beginning, the middle, or the end of the story, it's not clear how it ends up that way other than the author wants it to. A good author will be able to construct a plausible chain of events to then get you to that point. And a really good example of how Conan Doyle does this is in the story The Dancing Men. where he's called in. Well, actually, he's the husband of a woman from America, asks him, because they're in England, asks him for assistance because there's somebody leaving coded messages for his wife that causes her to get flustered and faint and all sorts of things. And then when he finally goes to the house to pay a visit, once he cracks the code, that because each time these secret messages, these coded messages are left, he sends copies to Sherlock Holmes. So once he cracks it, he goes there, and it turns out that this man has been killed. And his wife is the chief suspect, but she has a bullet lodged in her head and is unconscious. But as Sherlock Holmes in questions the servants, because the police theory is that the woman killed the husband, but Sherlock Holmes is like, well, that's probably not the case because they apparently loved each other. One of the servants says that there were 2 shots heard, but one sounded like an explosion and one sounded like a normal gunshot. And so when he looks at where the dead body has fallen, because it wasn't moved yet by the police, he notices that it's in front of a window. So he goes to the window frame and looks for a bullet in the window frame, and he finds it. And the police inspector says, "How did you find that bullet?" And he says, "I was looking for it." And Sherlock Holmes' intuition was that there were 3 shots, 2 of which were fired simultaneously, which led to the sound of an explosion. And then the bullet lodged in the woman's head was her committing suicide after her husband was killed. Now, that's a very tight, well-organized story where the conclusion that Sherlock Holmes is discovering is very well set up by the facts that Conan Doyle is presenting you, the reader. Because I always used to read mystery stories and try to solve them before I got to the conclusion of whoever the detective was. And I'm like, how does that make sense? Well, when you're young, that's a little hard to do because you don't necessarily know all the nuances that are involved with what the author is creating. And then again, that's not to say that every Sherlock Holmes story follows this line of reasoning because it's a little bit editorialized, and he had to keep publishing them to make a living. But there are a few key stories that really highlight this. Another one is I already quoted from Silver Blaze, where he was looking for something which he thought best explained the facts better than what the police did. And so actually reading those stories and understanding how Sherlock Holmes comes to his conclusions, because Doyle tells you, right? He tells you by the reading of the story. And of course, Sherlock Holmes will then usually explain to Watson his method of reasoning. Now, part of the way this works is Doyle had a great amount of knowledge of just a great many things in 19th century Britain and how they all worked. And so, based on the idea that Sherlock Holmes has this inner insight to see things for what they are, and then infer what probably, if not must have happened, then we get to these conclusions. 2 other good stories, now they're not short or long, that indicate this sort of like higher logic that ties things together is Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and Isaac Asimov's The Foundation trilogy, both of which have this higher order logic that governs what happens at the sort of visceral story level. Now, I read them both rather young, and they were not, well, for Asimov, it wasn't immediately obvious to me at the time what that was. Tolkien was a little bit more so. But reading them again this year, or last year, this year, I was like, oh, look at that. There is this higher level order that governs how these stories unfold in a way that, yes, the author had an intended goal in mind, but it was an intended goal that was aligned with a certain, to use C.S. Lewis's language from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, deep magic of reality that it works. Right? Again, a bad author would just have an end in mind and then just throw something together and not care about the links in the chain that get you there. Well, why? Why does that mean? Why does that happen? It's just, because the author wanted it to. And a lot of people read, schlock like that, and they come up with strange notions about how the world should work. Oh, I read this in a book. It should just turn out, or I saw it in a movie. It should just happen this way. I'm like, no. The chain of cause and effect is completely broken down. And again, history as well. Once you read enough history, you begin to see these universal patterns. So, for example, a non-historical method would be the development of numbers and number theory, right? You have certain numerical principles developing in Mesoamerica, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and India, all used to build megalithic structures. Well, for anybody who argues that numbers are a human convention, what are the odds that all of these humans all over the world at different times and places, not in connection with each other, would all invent more or less the same numerical principles? Well, it's pretty low. It's far more likely that they're observing or engaging with an already existing substructure that is embedded in the world that they discovered through either experimentation or insight. And so that would be that's just mathematics. But history is like that as well. And again, you only begin to see these connections by reading them again and again and again and again. So a perfect example would be the ambush that Arminius laid for the Romans in the 1st century at the Teutoburg forest with Varus. Basically, as he had when the Roman legion was marching through this road in the woods of Germany, it was out of formation. It wasn't in its normal defensive position. He had at a certain point along the trail a barricade set up, and then a barricade set up on either side of the road, and he ambushed the Romans and decimated them. Now, 800 years later, in 811 AD in Bulgaria, in the Battle of Pliska, I think Nicephorus, the Byzantine emperor, marches into an identical trap and is wiped out. And it's like, well, wow, isn't that interesting, right? It's the same kind of thing 800 years apart. But if you didn't, if you weren't paying attention, if you didn't read your history, you fell right into that trap again. And it bit you in the butt. Part of the problem now is we think we can avoid that with technology because the immediate physical effects, the immediate negative physical effects of these causes are removed from us. But what happens is the spiritual effects aren't removed. We still feel them. That's in part why we live in this mental health pandemic, because people can't deal with all of the spiritual / mental effects of what they've done. But they just pretend that that's not real, even though they take a lot of drugs to suppress it. So, but what we're beginning to see, though, is that the material reality is sort of like a rubber band that's been pulled to breaking point. And when it does break, it's going to, all this accumulated, stored up material effects are just going to, like a sledge, just swing back and just wipe out everybody caught in its path, which is, you don't want to be there for that. So that's the real challenge, is that we don't have this direct experience anymore. It's indirect through sacred texts, through history, through literature, and it just takes time to read. And I remember when I first read Shakespeare in high school, it was really hard. I'm like, how do you understand this guy? Partly you just got to keep reading him. Now, good introductory readings will have footnotes explaining what things mean, but eventually it makes sense to you. You eventually, by doing it, it makes sense. And though I think maybe reading a history book might be easier than Shakespeare, it's just written in a stylized form. And then once you have that, you can then start engaging in the sort of, I call it a game, but it's more than a game, where you look at these events in history or in literature and then try to apply the method that Sherlock Holmes discusses, the method of reasoning backwards, to see if you can more or less correctly identify what led to these events. Now, to do that, you have to gain a wide level of familiarity with what you're talking about. But once you've read history long enough, you can then start to engage in this exercise and pick an event and then try to figure out, okay, well, what plausibly went into this, especially with ancient literature or ancient history, where a lot's left out because either texts were lost or people didn't see fit to write about it. So in that case, that's a really useful exercise in order to develop these skills. Now, at some point, what I hope to be able to do is sort of write down and explain to people in a direct step-by-step fashion how to do this by looking back on how I did it. Since no one told me how to do it, it's more like I have to remember how I did it and then re-articulate it in a fashion that people will be able to understand. All right. That's all I got for tonight. So let's look at some of the chat here. We got GF. Hello. Hashim Awan. Hello. And then Hashim says, I sent you a link to my article on Quora. Yes, I saw that, Hashim. I will look at that soon. Thank you. The Reverend, hello. Corbin, hello. Mana, hello. Record Deepness, hello. Conquay Home, hello. Hashim Awan, don't you watch the live chat? Usually at the end, unless I get like a super chat notification, in which case I'll look at it right away. Imperator Forge, escaping the mold bug matrix. Yeah, true. Imperator Forge, Dante and Shakespeare, the OG black pillars of their day. GF, keep track of how many mistakes are made is also useful. Sometimes we conclude that stuff works this way or that other way because yes. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Sometimes you just have to have the learned experience of either doing it yourself or watching someone else do it, and it doesn't work. And you're like, well, okay, we may not be any closer to figuring out how to get at where we want to end up, but we don't do it that way anymore. That's true too. The real problem is there used to be an embedded culture and set of institutions that built that into people. It's just gone now. It has to be done from scratch. Hashimawan, remember the main To Hell with Spain? Have an intuition that it was a false flag. I think there was some naval archaeology that was done, which indicated that just a boiler blew up. It was an accident on the ship that was blamed on Spain. So, unless we want to say that naval archaeology was incorrect, which, I mean, maybe, but it was done in recent years, and there's not a whole lot of propaganda these days about the Spanish-American War. All right, everyone, that's all I have for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.